Hi and welcome to an introduction to design thinking. I'm Phil Delalande, I'm a principal consultant at Telstra Purple, and I help organizations with innovation and design, business strategy, product management. For the past 25 years, I've been involved in education, in healthcare, I've worked on media agencies, on startups, and I've run my own businesses. For a bit of background, Telstra Purple is the largest Australian-owned technology services business. We have over 1,500 consultants across digital innovation, adaptive infrastructure, and digital culture. We also have a graduate program that you're more than welcome to check out. Also, if you want to reach out, if you have any questions after this session, please ping me on Twitter or LinkedIn, and I also blog occasionally on Medium. Now let's talk about design thinking. Before we talk about design thinking, we need to consider human-centered design, which it's a part of. As the name suggests, it starts with the people you're designing for. It starts from a place of empathy. But it goes further and involves the end users in the design process. If we're building for people, we don't want to impose our views of the world to them. We don't want to impose our biases to them. Now, it seems like common sense, but when you think about it, it's often not the case. The typical process for an idea is, I have a great idea and I build it in my factory or my bedroom, and then I deliver my thing, my app, my service to the world. And if people can't figure out how to use it, it's kind of their problem. And that's how you hear people say things like, oh, I'm not computer savvy. And I often say, shouldn't computers be people savvy rather than the other way around? And that's exactly what human-centered design does. It flips that around and starts from people. Design thinking, according to the Interaction Design Foundation, is a non-linear, iterative process which seeks to understand users, challenge assumptions, redefine problems, and create innovative solutions to prototype and test. Now, before we go any further, I'd like to make a distinction between design and art. It may be clear for you, but you'd be surprised how many people don't understand that as such in the corporate world. For a lot of people, design is pretty pictures. But design is not art. Why not? Well, because design has to function. Let's look at a definition of design in the Oxford Dictionary. A plan or drawing produced to show the look and function or workings of a thing before it is made. Now, design is not only about how it looks. That's the tip of the iceberg. It is first about how it works. And it doesn't happen last. It comes at the beginning. Historically, in the software industry, engineers would build something and at the end of the process call designers and ask them to make it pretty. And that's just lipstick on a pig. You can't really make something usable, user-friendly. You can't design well if you consider design as an afterthought. It starts with design. Do you remember the Ford Edsel? Well, I suspect many of us don't. In 1957, Ford Motors launched a brand new vehicle. The Ford Edsel was going to be the new must-have car for middle-class America. It was futuristic, as you can see, packed with innovative features. And they launched it, and guess what? It was an absolute flop. And today is still considered a classic case study in product failure. 3 years on, it was taken off the market. Why? Why did it fail? Well, it's very simple. Although users were consulted during the planning phase of the project, the car was built according to what Ford's executives assumed would be successful. I'm going to say that again. The car was built according to what Ford's executives assumed would be successful. One of the golden rules in design thinking is that you are not the user. I hear it so many times. Let's say an accountant starting to develop an accounting tool and coming with all the answers going, I'm an accountant, I know what accountants want. No, you are not the user. You are one user among many users. different people have different goals, different needs, can be at different parts on the journey. This is called the false consensus effect, which is a cognitive bias in psychology. We overestimate how our beliefs, our preferences, our values, our habits are normal and typical of those of others. Now, with that in mind, let's look at the 5 steps of design thinking. This is the D-School model. If you Google design thinking, you're probably going to come across a few diagrams like this one. It's the most common one. And there's 5 steps which are empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. And though it's somewhat linear, it's also iterative. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But design thinking comes with a set of tools and techniques at each step of the process. But I would say it's very important not to get attached to the tools, not to get attached to the frameworks or the workshop formats. They are only a means to an end. To better understand design thinking, I like to introduce another diagram. This is called the double diamond. You can see there's 2 phases of divergence, exploration, opening, and convergence. You see the steps are quite similar: discover, define, develop, deliver. But most importantly, what's at the end there? There's a solution. And in consulting, very often people come to me and say, hey Phil, we want to implement a chatbot. And the design thinker is going to go, okay, this is a solution, but why? What is your problem? What is the problem you're trying to solve? How do you know this solution is the solution to the problem that you have in the first place? So it takes that reframing mindset. But even once you see we've gone up one step, we're in the middle there with problem definition. Even when you have a problem definition, as a design thinker, you're going to go, is it really the problem? Is this problem interconnected with other problems? Is it part of a bigger issue? What is the challenge that we can identify through this? So that's really a mindset of asking why. One of the key tools in design thinking is the 5 whys, to ask repeatedly why about the one thing, to understand the root cause of the problem. Now, if we look at how the double diamond superimposes itself on top of the 5 steps of design thinking, you see that that empathy phase is divergent, it's exploration, it's research, and then you need to define the problem. Diverge in ideation, that makes sense, but then converge in coming up with potential solutions to the problems we have identified. So let's look at those phases in more detail. The first one, called empathize, sometimes understand, is really a research phase, as I was just saying. And it takes that mindset of getting out of the building. I know it's pretty hard to say or to apply that in COVID-19 times, but getting out of the buildings, you can potentially do that with your machine as well, right? With Zoom and using ways to get out and talk to actual users. It takes interviewing people, but also observing them. It takes researching competitive products or services. It takes really that exploration collaboratively. You need to ask subject matter experts for their opinion on the subject, but it's really all the things research, right? Understanding people. What is the context? What is the market? What is happening there? Where do we want that to go? Now, that's really an exercise of empathy because you're walking in people's shoes. You are not the user. An interesting note, this is Henry Ford again, and he said something quite famous in the early 1900s after coming up with the first car, let's say, in mass production. He says, consumers cannot predict the future. If we'd asked people what they wanted, they would have said, we want faster horses. They wouldn't have said, we want a car, because cars didn't exist. So that's quite interesting. Back to what we were talking about just previously. Interviews, yes, interview people, but do not ask people what they want and just go and implement that. It's more subtle than that. You need to understand their goals and needs. Another famous quote is from Steve Jobs. And he said it's really hard to design products by focus groups. A lot of times people don't know what they want until you show it to them. Another example that's closer to us, just a year ago and in Sydney, that startup, Shoes of Prey, was selling shoes online. And they asked people if they would like to design their own shoes. And guess what? People said, yes, we'd love that. What a great idea. Let's do it. And you know what they did? Well, they didn't. So there's probably a combination of things that led to the demise of that startup, but that was probably the key point there. And what we can learn from that is that there are many wrong ways to ask a question. And be careful of the distinction between what people say and what people do. In that research phase, you need to both consider qualitative data, which you're going to gather by talking to people, and quantitative data, which you may gather with things like surveys, but also Google Analytics if you're talking about a digital product, that sort of thing. So the further you go with either of those, the more light you shed on the unknown. Now, let's look at the second step, a convergent step of defining what problem should we focus on. There's really prioritization matter here of you can't solve every problem at once. So you need to converge, to prioritize. Potentially you need to reframe and go, are we on the right path? Does our initial statement make sense? Or do we need to reframe that actually? Do we need to go back? So you see, when I was saying it's linear, but it's not, here from define, you could go back to research and go, we're answering some questions, but it's asking more questions. Let's go back to our desktops. Let's go back to the users. Let's ask them more questions along those lines so that you can inform your decisions. In user experience or service design, one thing that typically comes out of that research phase is personas. Who are our users? It's a common mistake to go, oh, my product is fantastic. It's like Facebook. It's for everyone. Even Facebook didn't start from addressing everybody. Facebook started on a very narrow sort of segment and then opened up to the world, if you like, but really progressively. So you need to understand your customers, your users, your members, the people, if you're designing service for everyone, again, what are their goals? What are their needs? What are their pain points? A good example is to consider Uber, for example. There's two clear personas. There's going to be the user of the service, and there's going to be the driver, right? But you could dig deeper and just consider that there can be a casual driver or a full-time driver. They may not have the same needs. They may not have the same friction points. They may not have the same concerns. On the other hand, if you consider the Uber user, you could be a very casual user using the app twice a year, or someone using the app daily. You may have different concerns. You may expect different things from the ride. So all those things are important to consider, and to that extent, you need to design and develop personas. This is an example card for a persona, and you see the goals and frustrations and motivations to me are extremely important. The brands and the technology are important as well, but you can go quite fine designing personas. What you want to make sure is that that persona is relatable and that it can be actually used as you are developing the service or the product. Personas are not only designed for designers, but for the whole team to empathize with. So it's got to be surfaced and visible on the walls, and design thinking is visible, right? It's going to help inform small or big decisions around, okay, what would Jill do in this case, right? Let's consider the world through her eyes. And obviously you want to go back to testing or to interviewing, but sometimes in the smaller decisions, you need to have that sort of quick go-to tool And that's going to be your persona definition. So a persona is an archetype. It's not a person, it's a type of person. And there might be a risk of having too many personas, but it's important to adapt the number and precision of your personas to what you're trying to achieve as a group, as a team. Now, once you have personas, you can design their journeys. This is called journey mapping. As I was saying before, a key principle of design thinking is visualization, visual communication. So in a design-led organization, things are not only designed, but they're also made visible to others. You would see the artifacts on the wall. Why? Because of the importance of shared understanding. Normal conversations lead people to think they agree, but they don't necessarily agree. They just talk, when someone else talked. And like, how much of an agreement do you have? Documentation leaves a lot of room to interpretation, but visualization helps achieve a shared understanding. A common tool in design thinking is journey mapping. Once you've defined your personas, you want to step in their shoes and map out their experience step by step. Of course, you need to define what that end-to-end process is, where it's going to start and end. You can't map everything every day. So sometimes you need to focus on certain areas, on certain interactions. But from that, you see there's some red and green cards. The red cards symbolize the fact that you're going to identify pain points. And the green areas are potential opportunities that may surface from that. So what does it look like? Now you can see how the person from 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. Experiences the day. And as I was saying, it really depends what you're trying to achieve. You're not going to map the same things if you are trying to map the experience of a customer with their bank, or of a person walking into a library or Centrelink. So you really have to map out whatever makes sense. What's important as well is who participates in that exercise. I would say if you have a bunch of designers but no user or no subject matter expert, how correct is that map going to be? So really, in both elaborating and sharing that journey map, you need to have that collaborative effect, and you need to involve the right people. Now, the third step here is ideation. It's a divergence stage, and you may have heard about co-design or design studios. And again, it's the power of many. It's people ideating together, people coming up with ideas together. You don't want to come and just focus on the first idea you had while driving to work in the morning and go, yeah, that's it, that's what we want to do. That's a mistake. You really want to explore potential ideas. That's where the real innovation takes place, and it's quantity over quality. I've got a little story about that. A ceramics teacher split her class in two, and she asked one group to make a perfect vase over the whole semester, while the other half was going to make as many vases as possible over the same time period. And at the end of the semester, in which group do you think she found the best and the best made vases? Well, as you can guess, the group that focused on quantity, not quality, got the best results. Now that's the power of experimentation. So if you look at the last line here, wacky is okay. It's important in ideation to have no filters, to be able to say something that may sound stupid, but you know what? It's not stupid, because it may be an idea that sparks in someone else's head and they come up with something else. That's innovation as well. It's really things that you don't expect to go together, but unless you break the mold, you break the rules, you're not going to find that. This is another illustration of quality versus quantity in ideation. Really what you want to do is generate as many ideas as possible and spark ideas that you wouldn't have naturally considered. And there's a bunch of tools and techniques you can use for that, like Crazy Eights, Lotus Blossoms. Now let's explore some of those ideation tools. The Crazy Eight, for example, is a workshop where a cross-functional team, and I insist, it's not just for designers. You need people from different areas that are involved in the project. And for the first phase, they're going to spend some time reflecting on probably the results of the research and what came out of that research phase and problem definition phase. And then they're going to doodle solutions. And really, it's not a designer's job. It's as long as you can draw rectangles and circles and write, it's good enough. It's all we need, actually. And then the probably most interesting part of the exercise is you're going to divide your page in 8 sections, and you have 8 minutes to come up with 8 potential solutions to that problem. So what it does is, rather than just land on the first idea you need to push the boundaries, and you only have 8 minutes. So it's very creative, very upbeat, and I insist design thinking should be done with transparency and trust, and it should be fun. And finally, you have a little more time to pick one of those sketches that you've been working on, one of those variations, and go more into the details. But we're still working with paper. So that solution sketch is usually an A4 page with 3 horizontal post-its that show either a flow or 3 different screens. It really depends what we're doing, but you figure out the details. And then what you do is you can have an exercise of silent voting. So that's one of the important points. We want to make sure that it's not just the loudest person in the room that's heard all the time that shares their opinion. We want to level that up, and we want to be able to hear every voice. Even someone who could be very timid may have, amazing ideas. So when we stick all the solution sketches to the walls and give everyone a few minutes to silently walk and observe and maybe ask questions, after that you give everybody dot stickers and they're going to vote, but there's not that bias and that influence, that vocal influence. Another exercise is Lotus Blossom. This one's my little favorite. It starts from a problem statement, an opportunity, an idea, and you write that in the middle. And then a bit in a similar way to the Crazy Eight, you need to come up not with 1 or 2 or 3, but with 8 different ideas on how to address that problem. So you can do that in pairs, you can do a round robin, you can move stations, you can do that with large groups as well. It's a very upbeat and very fun exercise. But the beauty of it is, once you've come up with 8 different potential ways to address that problem, you may need to dig deeper. And what you're going to do is, I've got an example here with Get More Active at the center, and you see we've come up with 8 different ideas, but cycle here becomes the center of another Lotus Blossom, where you're going to come up with 8 different ideas on how might that take shape, how might we do it. And it's really, you come up with a lot of volume, as you can see, and if you're stuck, you can find ways around people getting stuck by getting them to collaborate. So as you may understand, there you can end up with a lot of volume, a lot of post-it notes on the wall, and it can be really overwhelming, let's say, and that's normal. That's a divergence phase, and it can be uncomfortable, and sometimes the stakeholders can break a bit of a sweat, but that's fine because you're really exploring, you're really opening up during that phase. What do you do then when you want to converge? Well, what we're looking at here is some affinity mapping, or some grouping, if you like, where after ideating, people are going to group some post-its. Maybe some ideas are pretty much the same, sometimes exactly the same. So let's just bunch them up together. It's interesting to know that they came up several times, but let's just gather those different groups and themes, and then find probably like the yellow stickers here find what title we could give to this given category. That's an interesting exercise, and sometimes I run it several times, if you like, or I give the same material to two groups and they need to do the affinity mapping with the same material, but you're going to end up with different results. And sometimes it's going to be the same. It can be a good sign. Sometimes they're different because, there's different ways to skin a cat. There's different ways to analyze data. It's not science, but you need to have that diligence of coming at a problem from different angles. Another thing you do is, I was talking about voting earlier, but is really that silent voting around, out of all those groups, what should we address first? What is really the most crucial point? And as a team, as a group within that workshop, people are going to vote for one or the other, usually again to vote silently. Sometimes you give, the main stakeholder, the decision maker, you're going to give them more votes than other people because they are wearing the hat. They're going to be held accountable at the end. But it's very interesting to see the discussions that can take place after that. Once you've done that, you can start seeing a bit of a shape of an order of priority. Now, there's many more tools for prioritization, but this is just to give you a bit of a taste. Now, let's look at the fourth phase, prototype. One of the foundations of design thinking is the fact that you want to test ideas before spending time and money building the wrong thing. So again, in an environment I know quite well, software development, waterfall projects, there are a few stories of millions of dollars being invested in building something that actually nobody wanted to use. And there's still a default for some people to sort of get attached to the tools and just follow their ideas into building and delivering something that actually is not validated. That's why you want to run very cheap, very rapid experiments very early on to go, is this an idea? Does anybody want it? So when you fake something, when you prototype something, it still has to be believable because you're going to take it to the users and you're going to try and observe them either succeed or fail with that prototype that you've built. One example I like to use is a landing page. Say you want to write a book. Rather than spend 12 months writing your book and investing in publishing costs and investing in marketing, and then only finding out whether it's successful or not, probably a few months later than that, what you can do is spin up a landing page tomorrow with the title of the book you'd like to write, and maybe the chapter structure, and a registration form, and direct people to it maybe with advertising, AdWords, or things like that. And if people want to read it, they will register their interest. If they don't, well, the waste is minimal. You've only invested little time and funds in proving your idea. So it's kind of a prototype of a book without having to write the book to test the idea. Another famous example of a prototype is Dropbox video prototype made in 2008. Drew Houston knew that his product wasn't ready for a public launch yet, but he still wanted to gauge whether it solved a problem for other people. So what he did is he cheated a little bit and he recorded a video of his prototype. At the bottom of the video, there was a form to join a waiting list for the private beta. And he shared that on YouTube. Wait and see. Well, believe it or not, overnight, Dropbox grew their waiting list from 5,000 to 75,000 subscribers. Very good sign that they could move ahead confidently. Digital prototypes are very common. You can make them on Adobe XD, Figma, or Sketch. They're interactive, clickable prototypes. They look real and believable, but usually something like that takes a few hours, maybe a few days to build, as opposed to weeks or months of development costs. But one thing to watch out is you need to ask yourself at all times, what is it you're trying to prove with this prototype? Now, the fifth and final step in design thinking is test. Are we on the right track? You want to test the prototype that you've built to validate your most promising ideas that you've had to solve the problem that you defined earlier. Now, as a rule of thumb, you want to test with at least 5 real users. And I'm talking about real users, not the people sitting around you, because people sitting around you are people like you. Now, you want to test with, of course, as many people as you need to learn about whether you are solving the problem with this prototype. A prototype is not a full-blown app. A prototype is going to be addressing your highest risk. Here you have a usability testing setup where a team are observing a facilitator that's sitting with the user, and the user is navigating the app or product or service. Why do you have that setup? Well, because you don't want too many people in the face of the user as they are interacting with the product. What do you want to be testing for? Well, you want to be testing for usability. And that's why I was saying you cannot argue that in a 1-hour test or in a 20-minute test, someone would be able to interact with every possible feature in a product or a service. It depends what the scope is, obviously, but you want really to focus on certain areas with your prototype. Now, when you test for usability, you test for learnability, you test for efficiency, for clarity. Does the wording make sense? You test for memorability. Are people struggling to find something in the space or in the interface? For software, you want to test for error management. You want to test for satisfaction. Do they understand what's happening? Do they understand what they're supposed to be doing? As the team observes, why do you need the whole team to be there with potentially engineers, subject matter experts? Why do you need the whole team to observe? Again, it's for that shared understanding. There's going to be aha moments when the user come across friction points you may not have anticipated, when they may be confused, or on the other hand, they may succeed. And that's really important for the whole team to be there, rather than the designer later coming back and going, oh, by the way, I've talked to the users and they, that's what happened. That's secondhand. It doesn't work like that. You want people to experience it firsthand. So these are the 5 steps of design thinking: empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. Let's look at the principles and mindsets behind design thinking. And we've seen most of them throughout the past few minutes. It starts with empathy, a deep human focus to gain insights into people's lives, needs, goals, pain points. It involves reframing the problem and gaining new perspectives, taking a more holistic approach, looking at the context. It follows divergence and convergence cycles, so that you explore, you go really wide, but then you need to prioritize and understand where to focus first. Design thinking encourages collaboration, multidisciplinary teams working together to the same outcome. So it's not only designers, it's not designers and engineers, it's subject matter experts, it's whoever makes sense to be there, end users, so that we can understand and solve the problem together. So it really leverages inclusion and diversity of thoughts. Experimentation, something people in organizations still struggle very much with today. And iterations. As we said before, design thinking is not linear. What if you learn new facts about your users? Are you going to ignore them because you've already done the research? No, of course, you're going to integrate it. You're going to inspect and adapt. What if you're testing your prototype and you learn, well, you see that users are struggling with certain functionalities, or you understand that actually it doesn't really solve their problem. They're not really excited with it. It doesn't work. Well, you need to go back to either prototyping or ideation So it's an ever-evolving process. Now, what are the applications for design thinking? Well, really the sky's the limit, and I hope you can appreciate that. Service design, experience design, product design, organizational design, urban design, social design, and you can imagine the applications for design thinking in education. I love the education space because you apply design thinking not only to how the students can learn, but also on how the school can be run. And so the possibilities are endless in healthcare, in governments, in politics, in transport. Now, a lot of things that have traditionally been pushed down to the users and imposed by the company, the business, the government, the organizations, need to be redesigned with a human-centered approach. Now, here are a few resources I wanted to share with you. What is Design Thinking by the Interaction Design Foundation, The History of Design Thinking by IDEO, Tools and Case Studies by IDEO again, and maybe the Design Sprint by Google Ventures, an application of design thinking into a one-week sprint to solve a crucial business problem. A couple of books here. We have the Design Thinking Playbook by Michael Lyric and The Design of Everyday Things by Don Norman that I encourage you to read. Now, I'd like to challenge you to try and apply the design thinking process next time you're solving a problem. Don't forget you can apply design thinking at many levels. Sometimes over weeks, involving hundreds of people, but sometimes over a few minutes, defining and exploring solutions to a problem. Well, that's it. I hope you enjoyed this session. Don't hesitate to reach out if you want to learn more about design thinking or Telstra Purple. Thank you.